Protected areas like national parks and national reserves do a lot to protect the rights of endangered species. However, at the same time, they actually do very little to protect the rights of the humans who've been living in these areas for centuries. Thousands of families across the country have been evicted from their traditional homes, which happen to fall inside these protected areas. All of this is done in order to create a pristine habitat for these endangered species. Democratic governance laws, like the Forest Rights Act, didn't help them. And once they were evicted, development projects actually sprung up very close to their old homes. So why evict them at all? These are the questions that are answered in part by Losing Ground. Losing Ground is a new interactive map designed by the Environmental Justice Atlas and Kalpavriksha, which is an NGO based out of India. The product of 3 years of intensive fieldwork with on-ground communities, activists, and NGOs. This map shows us the state of evictions and displacements across 29 protected areas in India. In the process, it shows us how these national parks and reserves, the cornerstones of our conservation models, are actually disenfranchising Indigenous people. We spoke to the team to find out more about what they did and why they did it.
Very first and very strong impediment against a very democratic and rights-based policy like Forest Rights Act is the mindset, which we've had since colonial times of retaining the control, not trusting the local people, not trusting the local systems. And that is what the Forest Rights Act has faced right from the beginning. And even while it was being debated, there were huge debates. It's very interesting that there is actually a large number of conservation organizations and researchers who truly believe that if this act is implemented in true honesty and with the spirit of the act, it could actually lead to democratizing conservation, wildlife conservation in India. But then there is a handful of conservation organizations, very strong, very vocal, well-funded, and who have also been engaged with many of the displacement programs, who've been strongly against the act right from the beginning. And this in addition to the Forest Department, who's been the agency managing these protected areas and has had control over these protected areas. So this resulted into a large number of people associated with the Forest Department and conservation organizations taking the law to the court right in the beginning as soon as it was implemented. And it eventually reached the Supreme Court, where it continues to be argued, and one of the interim orders almost led to eviction of about 1 million people in India till it was stopped because of a huge hue and cry that was created around it. So this is the same attitude that plays out on the ground. In general, the implementation of the act in the country is really low, but in protected areas is even less. Not only is the implementation very less, it's also getting information about implementation is near impossible. It's almost like mentioning the word Forest Rights Act in protected areas is a crime, and you immediately face a negative reaction.
The international pressure as well that there are on climate change and greening policy, and also like the expansion of protected areas at the international level, somehow as creating also a narrative that we need to secure these protected areas. This narrative has somehow also strengthened the power of the Forest Department and the monopoly of the Forest Department over these territories. So this might also have affected the same implementation of the Forest Rights Act in India. So we can say that maybe this availability of funding not used properly, they have somehow helped also in fortify the so-called forest conservation model in India.
These impacts have generally been negative if you look at it from terms of local perspectives or local communities. There are displacement is one of the impacts, but there's restrictions on access to forests and forest produce. There's restriction on use. People are not allowed to enter. These wildlife policies, they've taken a generalized restrictive policy on use of forests without taking into consideration that there is a symbiosis between local communities and wildlife. there's a relationship, cultural and environmental relationship between these local communities. So if I had to give one example, if we can look at the Van Gujar community. So these are traditional pastoralist communities living in the western Himalayan regions. They practice transhumance. They during the summer months they live in the higher Himalayas, and during the winters they come to the lower Shivaliks. Now, see what has been the impact of restricting people from entering these forest areas. Van Gujars, this practice of transhumance has stopped. Like the Van Gujars have had to settle down in forest areas, and even then, they're continuously harassed by forest officials, terming them encroachers, sexual harassments against women. People are not allowed to, they are not allowed to sell them. Selling the milk was one of it. Now they have small amount of land which they use for agriculture. Even that is, forest officials come with bulldozers, tractors. They destroy the whole thing. So, and now again, that has been one of the impacts of just the wildlife policy. If you look at how the displacement has been of Van Gujars, not to talk about how they have been brutally evicted, but even the relocation where the forest department, where the state has claimed that they've been given proper compensation. The land has been infertile. They've been given land which they cannot use. No proper compensation to give. Not proper compensation given to them. Houses not given to them. They've been shifted to lands which are still forest lands, and there's still elephants passing through that area, tigers passing through that area, and that the conflict still increase. So I think, to talk about it, the general impact of this one type of policy without recognizing local communities' rights and use of these forests, and the relationship has been negative. The forest lands which have been vacated, even these land, there is the development activities and all going on. So where is the conserving habitat as the forest, as it is always claimed, as it is claimed here?
While traveling in India and visiting these relocated communities, they were all of them. They were all in a very high state of poverty. And when we are speaking in in the media, we hear about how this relocation project has been like voluntary, and there has been the consent of the communities for the relocation. Most of the time, we have the proof that this has not happened, or if consent has been given, it was really under coercion. So many communities told us that they really didn't have any choice. Then the pressure inside the forest was so high that they just had to leave. Or somehow we also found in certain communities that white sheet of papers were given to them to sign their consent on relocation. So here we see a lot of illegality that have been really followed this relocation in India. But for me, what is also important to highlight is that these relocation are not only impacting their socioeconomic status of this community, but also their psychologies. As in many cases, these local community, they live in these forest areas, they inhabited these forest areas that are so much connected with their culture and their identity. So there is a very violent process of uprooting this community from their house that in many cases represent also their sacred spaces. So there are like deity in this forest. So it means obviously cut off this community from their entire culture and the entire way of living. And to speak about the positive relocation that the government is showcasing, for example, like the Similipal, the local community from Similipal Tiger Reserve in Odisha, they claim that have been a successful relocation. But when I went to visit the local community, they were really disappointed because what the government promised to them was agricultural land, but actually they only received homestead land. So they became just wage labor. And they were also living, one village was 100 kilometers far away from the forest, so also cut off from their relatives, because there are still villages inside Similipal Tiger Reserve. The community forest resource rights have been recognized in many of the villages, but beside that, this relocation is still going on.
So we see that this model of conservation has been undemocratic, violative of human rights, and has done little for the social and cultural well-being. But how has it fared ecologically speaking? What has it done for the long-term ecological security? As lay people, without claiming to be ecological scientists, we would try and understand it in three steps and at three levels. First, to look at the very site itself, from where the relocations are taking place. In order to understand what was the ecological basis for these relocations, we filed right to information applications, and we found that in almost none of the sites any detailed site-based research had been carried out to understand whether there was an irreversible damage being done to the species or the habitat because of the presence of the communities which were being relocated from these areas. Almost no research had been done as to what was the ecological relationship of these people with their resources, whether they had any traditional systems which led to conservation of these resources. In fact, we came across one research which was published in 2014 by Kim, Clark and Miller. They were trying to understand the poaching in tiger reserves in India. And one of the unintended outcomes of their research was that they found that there was almost no correlation between the tiger population and presence and density of villages in these tiger reserves. In fact, when we started looking at the tiger census reports since 2010 onwards, we find that there has been consistently an increase in the number of tigers in almost all reserves. There are very few reserves where the populations have been going down. And in fact, in BRT or Biligiri Rangaswamy Temple Sanctuary in Karnataka, which is one of the few tiger reserves where almost all settlements have received community forest resource rights under the Forest Rights Act and have been exercising their rights, the population of tigers has almost or more than doubled in last 1 decade. So clearly there is no evidence to say that presence of people necessarily causes ecological, compromises ecological security. The second step would be, we are talking about a very small geographical area of our country, which is just 5%, which is under these protected areas. The post-2020 global biodiversity framework, as we spoke about, says that we need to bring at least 30% of our area under conservation to achieve long-term ecological security. So if the 5% area attracts this level of conflict, human rights violations, how can we hope to achieve conservation in 30%, and I would say more than 30% area which we need to do to achieve long-term ecological security? Third and but very importantly, many of these communities which are being relocated are Adivasi communities, sometimes also some very vulnerable, particularly vulnerable tribal communities. These communities still represent the cultural values of contentment, of reciprocity, of living in harmony with nature, of community living, and have among the least carbon footprint. We are actually destroying these cultures by these relocation programs and assimilating them into highly consumptive economy, which is fundamentally based on destruction of nature. The cultures which can actually provide us answers for a long-term human sustainability on this planet are being destroyed by the cultures which are the very cause of destruction of nature in the first place.